Men, and I use the term loosely, the Harton. The Harton is killing me a little bit at a time over here. I haven't videoed a lot of this because the bike was loaded with booby traps. And you know, you kind of start out with a little bit of a plan of what you're going to try to do and how you're going to video it and, you know, yada yada. Unfortunately, nobody told the machine what was expected of it, and it's loaded with booby traps. So, you know, every little booby trap that comes along changes the direction of which way the video was maybe going to go. And, you know, I'm a one-man operation here. I do the video, I edit the video, I do the machining, the cylinder boring, the motorcycle, but the whole thing, you know, I do it all. So it's not like I got a guy with the camera following me around who could, you know, refocus as the problem changes. And the problem's changed often on this thing. But anyway, let's do a little overview of the motorcycle at large. And then I'm going to show you some booby traps. And then I'm going to try to show you some progress. And hopefully there will be this video with some older footage rolled in. And then maybe one more video when I actually pull it outside and put my leg to the Kickstarter. And God only knows how that's going to go, but we'll see. But anyway, let's take a look at the bike itself and a little bit as to how it was put together, because it is kind of interesting, and it actually makes a pretty nice installation for something that was cobbled together out of a Sportster motor and a Norton frame. This is a Norton featherbed frame, I do believe. And you Norton guys could correct me where I'm wrong. But as I understand it, there's at least two versions of this. This is the wide line featherbed frame, and then there is a slim line featherbed frame. And the slim line featherbed frame could be found on such things as mattresses, you know, the big English single. And essentially the top tubes were narrower. But this is the wide line frame, and it's very handy because the cylinders, the Harley cylinders, fit up between these frame tubes, so you can get the rocker boxes and the cylinder heads and the jugs off no sweat. The construction is kind of interesting. There's a frame tube, well, two of them, one on each side, and this is one piece of metal, bent all the way down and back up to the neck post. And it's got this nicely gusseted area tying it all together. This is a substantial frame. This is kind of the opposite of a Sportster frame, which is very, very narrow. Single tube instead of double tube on the top. This would seem to me to be obviously more robust than a CH frame. And you know, Harley on the CH, you know, they wrapped the frame around the engine and the oil tank and, you know, made it as tight of a package as they could get. But this, you know, I'm looking at the triangulation and the way it's braced. This is really a pretty nice arrangement. We're going to look at the mounting here of this thing too in a second. Well, we're going to look at the mounting of it like right now. Way down in behind here is the part of the rear motor mount. And this was added to accommodate the Sportster engine. And essentially it's a piece of, oh, it looks like maybe 1/8 inch steel welded to a cross tube that goes across here. And it picks up the bottom two bolt holes of the Harley motor mount. And then up here is a piece of angle iron. Looks like it's probably 1/8 of an inch thick steel too, that picks up the top two Sportster rear engine mount bolts, and it's got a couple of tabs on it welded to it that are bolted to a couple of tabs on the frame. Pretty simple, straightforward, easy to make. If I were going to do this over again today, Like I say, this steel and this steel down in here looks like it's 1/8 inch. I think I would probably use at least 3/16, maybe 1/4 inch, and I would make one steel plate that goes from the top and welds to the bottom, and weld it all together. And this area here where it's bolted, I think I would replace that with a weld too. I don't know, maybe not. But anyway, simple enough on the back. Just welded some angle iron and some flat plate to the frame and bolted the motor mount to it. My customer is the guy who built this apparently. He claims not to have overhauled the engine. The engine was put together by some friends of his out of junk laying around, I guess, and it's obvious. But he claims to have built the bike. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And like I say, I would have just made one piece of steel and I would have welded it down here on this cross member and up here onto these two tabs, and it would have been a lot thicker. But simple enough, straightforward enough to do. He says one of his big problems was lining the sprocket up, the drive sprocket up with the sprocket on the wheel. And he had to do a lot of shifting around on the engine left and right to get it to line up correctly. Front motor mounts, simple enough. A couple of slabs of aluminum, a couple of spacers made, bolts to the same place on the engine where the Harley mount would have bolted. Got a big twin kickstand bolted to the side plate. The aluminum is nice. I might have made them out of steel just because the kickstand is bolted to it. But we'll see. It's his bike. He'll see how it holds up. This big open square area in here cradles the Harley engine almost perfectly. I mean, couldn't really get any easier than that. This is, of course, the XLCH square lunchbox type oil tank. This corner was cut off to clear this frame tube. It picks up a couple of tabs in here with a couple of bolts, and it's pretty securely mounted in there. He had a very funky oil line set up on here, and I've rerouted a lot of lines, changed the way it was hooked up, so it's hooked up now, except for the oil filter, exactly the way it would have been hooked up on a Harley. He had kind of a combination of Harley Norton oil line routing on there, and I just didn't think it could work very good. So let's start talking about some of the booby traps. When I took the engine out of the frame, these front mounts looked a little cattywampus. And when I got ready to put it back in, I started looking at these things. This one was a little bit too long, and it was saw cut. Well, it wasn't straight saw cut, so I ended up having to put it in a lathe, flatten the ends off, and shorten it a little bit. No big deal, but one of these things. It's not a bolt together thing. You got to do a little machining first. There's another round spacer on this side of the engine mount, and same thing. It was saw cut. It was saw cut at an angle. Had to straighten it out, square it up, and shorten it a little bit, and it fit in there very nicely. The engine is pretty significantly off-center. What effect that'll have on the handling, I don't know. It's significantly off-center on a Sportster too, although not as much as this is. Okay, here's another booby trap for you. The screws that hold the derby cover on. Simple enough, put the screws in. Well, here's the screws that came with it, one of the screws. And the screw is just a little bit longer than it needed to be. And it went all the way through, and it hit this ridge before it actually tightened the cover up all the way. And if you recall from the take apart video, I popped this cover off and I got a bath of oil that fell out of there. There are some centrifugal holes in the middle of the hub. They're designed to sling oil out. And I thought that was where the oil was coming in. I'm now inclined to believe that since these screws hit this ridge here before they actually tighten the cover up, that actually maybe the cover wasn't all the way on and that oil was just leaking in around the gasket. So that was a little bit of a booby trap. Yeah, here's another booby trap built into this thing. This is 2 links off of the O-ring chain that was originally installed. Well, I was getting ready to put the chain back on, and you notice this little bit of metal that's missing over here. I think somebody shortened the chain that was too long, and when they cut through the outer plate, they cut through this inner plate too. So now the chain is just this little sliver of metal holding it together. You know, what the fuck? I didn't feel comfortable putting it together, because if it decided to let loose and wad all the chain up behind the cam cover, it would have busted a bunch of shit. I didn't like the O-ring chain anyway, so this owner is getting a new chain. I keep pieces of old chain laying around because I was just going to splice them in a couple of links and use 2 master links on it. As it happens, the O-ring chain that I had laying around, I keep leftover pieces of chain, and the pin was a different diameter. So I couldn't use my O-ring chain with his old O-ring chain. Therefore, I cannot splice a new link in there, and he ended up buying a new chain. But, you know, another little booby trap just waiting to get you. Here's another little booby trap that was waiting to get me. The pistons that were in this were 20 over. I happen to have a set of 30 pistons over in stock, so I figured no big deal, bore it out, we'll put pistons in there. So I took my measurements, compared them to my new 30 over piston, and in the one direction, and I don't remember which direction, in one direction, the cylinders were already big enough to fit the skirt of the piston in them. In the other direction, of course, they weren't big enough, so the piston would go in. But anyway, these cylinders were out around by 4 or 5 thousandths of an inch, and they were outer straight by 4 or 5 thousandths of an inch. The top was 4 thousandths bigger than the bottom. And I was going to do it on my boring machine because that just works better. But the boring machine has 3 fingers that expand into the cylinder to center the boring head over the jug. And depending on where the fingers ended up and where the outer round was located, you know, the boring head would have been nearly impossible to center over this thing. I mean, it might have been centered at the top, but then it wouldn't have been centered at the bottom. You know, and I would have bored all the one side, but not the other side, or I would have bored just the top instead of the bottom, or vice versa. I probably would have had to go 40 over to clean it up on the boring machine. So I just used my Sunnin rigid hone on it, and I think I stated in an earlier video I did on boring cylinders that you could feel sometimes the hone will grab when something's out around, because when the stones get to the spot where it's tight, you know, they'll get tight, and then they'll go past that and they'll just kind of pop over on you. Anyway, when I stuck the hone in there and pulled the trigger on my big drill, damn near ripped the drill out of my hand because the thing was just grabbing. And it took a bit of finagling, but as stated in a previous video on boring jugs, you could figure out where you're fat, where you're small, and hone accordingly. So I was able to manipulate the hone to get it back straight again and to get it back round again. But once again, something that should have been a relatively simple operation turned into something loaded with booby traps. Yet another booby trap. This is what's left of the bracket that held the oil filter adapter to the frame. Except for this little tiny part here, it was cracked all the way across, so of course when I started messing with it, it broke in two. So now I got to make another oil filter mounting bracket. You say, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal was I had to get crammed down way in behind over here. Previously, it had been installed in such a way that it didn't conform to the bends and the engine mounting bracket to which it was bolted, and it just didn't work out. But anyway, I had to make a new one of those. So, you know, add another couple hours on the project while you're fiddling around with that. And then let's throw the oil filter in. You know, there's a gazillion aftermarket Harley oil filter type things on the market. This thing has a Norton one on there, so now I got a special order a Norton oil filter for it. You know, one of the reasons the videoing was so inconsistent on this bike was that it kept throwing me curveballs. And one of the curveballs it threw was the oil tank. And see this fuzz on here? That doesn't look like much, and indeed it's not. But I pulled out 5 or 6 magnetfuls of fuzz like this. The first magnetful was a fucking golf ball. I mean, there was metal in there, fully, you know, there was a full teaspoonful of metal flakes that came out of this thing. So, you know, instead of just, well, you know, hook up some oil lines, put some oil in, you're good to go. Now you're talking remove the tank, flushing over and over and over again, running a magnet through there. I had to do the thing where I put a little parts washer in it, you know, fill it up with mineral spirits or parts washer fluid, shake it around, break all the crud loose, you know, run the magnet around there many times. And finally I got it to where the magnet was coming out pretty clean. Actually, I got 2 magnets I used on this, and you know, I got to the last real bad one, this one here, and I decided to save it, and I used the other magnet to get the last residual out of there. But you know, this is a time-consuming thing, and believe me, you know, when I do these oil tanks, I blast them out with the power washer, and talk about a mess. You got shits going everywhere, you know, and then in and out of the parts washer. It's just a hard thing to video easily, that's for sure. But anyway, you know, a curveball, a booby trap is what I like to call it. You know, had I not done the due diligence and checked that, you know, a guy could have fired up this new motor and it would be trashed in, you know, 100 miles with all this crud circulating in there. And now, that uniquely satisfying moment when you realize that it might actually run again. Just a quick reminder, you can help support and grow this channel, first of all and most importantly, by hitting that subscribe button. So if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. If you'd like to do a little more, join me on Patreon. Links down below. So go ahead and join me on Patreon if you feel so inclined. And finally, coffee cups, stickers, and gas tank covers are available. This is a new design coffee cup. I like the old ones, but I like these new ones even better. Links will be provided in the description down below. Get yourself some. And thank you all ever so much for watching these videos. I really appreciate it. Bye.